The year is 1219. The morning sun bleeds gold across the endless plains of Central Asia, its rays glinting off the domes and walls of Otrar, a thriving jewel on the Silk Road. A lone messenger approaches the city's gates, his face hardened by the weight of a message that will forever alter the destiny of nations. He brings word of a massacre, an entire caravan of Mongol merchants slaughtered without mercy, their precious goods stolen, their bodies abandoned to decay under the cruel desert sun. Inside Otrar, the governor, bloated with arrogance and blinded by his own delusions of power, dismisses the Mongols' demand for justice with a mocking laugh. He does not yet realize that his actions have awakened a storm unlike any the world has ever known, a storm that will thunder across continents, shattering kingdoms, and reshaping the very foundation of civilization itself. Within months, the ground will tremble beneath the relentless charge of 200,000 Mongol warriors, their war cries rolling like thunder toward Otrar's walls. Yet this is far more than a tale of one city's destruction. This is the story of a fierce and relentless people, born from the harsh steppes of Mongolia, who would carve out the largest land empire the world has ever seen. A realm stretching from the vast Pacific Ocean to the very gates of Vienna. This is a story of conquest so ferocious, so all-consuming, that history has yet to witness its equal. This is the story of the Mongol Empire. The man who would become known as Genghis Khan was born Temujin around 1162, into a world where survival meant everything and weakness meant death. The Mongol steppes were a harsh crucible where only the strongest tribes could thrive. Young Temujin learned early that in this unforgiving landscape, unity meant power, and power meant survival. His childhood was marked by betrayal, abandonment, and constant warfare between rival clans. His father was poisoned by enemies when Temujin was just 9 years old, leaving his family to face starvation and exile. But from these ashes of hardship rose something unprecedented. Temujin possessed a genius for warfare and an even greater gift for uniting fractured peoples under a single banner. He understood that the traditional Mongol way of endless tribal warfare was a path to nowhere. Instead, he envisioned something revolutionary. A unified nation of all Mongol tribes that could turn their martial prowess outward against the settled civilizations that had grown fat and complacent behind their walls. By 1206, Temujin had achieved the impossible. Through a combination of brilliant military strategy, psychological manipulation, and sheer force of will, he had united the warring Mongol tribes under his leadership. At a great assembly called a Kurultai, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, which means universal ruler. The scattered tribes of Mongolia were now a single, terrifying force, but Genghis Khan's ambitions stretched far beyond the steppes. He looked toward the great sedentary empires that surrounded Mongolia and saw not formidable enemies, but ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. The Mongol military machine that Genghis Khan created was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Traditional armies of the time were slow, cumbersome affairs that moved at the pace of infantry and supply wagons. The Mongols revolutionized warfare by creating an entirely cavalry-based force that could cover impossible distances at breathtaking speed. Each Mongol warrior maintained multiple horses, switching between them to maintain their mount's strength during long campaigns. This gave them a mobility advantage that their enemies simply could not match, but speed was just one component of their military superiority. The Mongols were master archers whose composite bows could accurately strike targets at distances up to 350 meters. They fought with a level of coordination and discipline that put professional armies to shame. Their decimal system of organization, with units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors, allowed for unprecedented flexibility on the battlefield. Commands could be transmitted quickly up and down the chain of command, enabling complex maneuvers that confused and overwhelmed their enemies. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongols understood the power of terror as a weapon of war. They deliberately cultivated a reputation for absolute ruthlessness. Cities that surrendered were often spared, while those that resisted faced complete annihilation. This psychological warfare proved incredibly effective. Often, enemy forces would flee or surrender without fighting when they learned that Mongol armies were approaching. The very name of Genghis Khan became synonymous with unstoppable destruction. The first major test of this new military machine came in 1209 when Genghis Khan launched his forces against the Western Xia Kingdom in what is now northwestern China. The Western Xia controlled crucial trade routes and had grown wealthy from taxing caravans traveling the Silk Road. Their defeat served as a perfect proving ground for Mongol tactics and demonstrated to the world that these nomadic warriors were far more than simple raiders. The siege of Zhongxing, the Western Xia capital, showcased another crucial Mongol innovation: their ability to adapt and learn from their enemies. Traditional nomadic armies were hopeless against fortified cities, but the Mongols quickly adopted Chinese siege techniques and weaponry. They recruited Chinese engineers and learned to build and operate catapults, trebuchets, and other siege engines. Within a generation, the Mongols had transformed from a purely nomadic force into masters of siege warfare. But it was the conquest of the Jin Dynasty in northern China that truly announced the Mongols as a world power. Beginning in 1211, Genghis Khan's armies swept across the Great Wall and into the heart of Chinese civilization. The Jin Dynasty boasted millions of subjects, sophisticated military technology, and fortified cities that had never fallen to nomadic attacks. Yet within 2 decades, this ancient empire lay in ruins. The fall of Beijing in 1215 sent shockwaves throughout the civilized world. The city that had stood as a symbol of Chinese power and culture for centuries was reduced to smoking rubble. Contemporary accounts describe streets littered with corpses and refugees fleeing in all directions. The psychological impact of this victory cannot be overstated. If the mighty Jin dynasty could fall to these nomadic warriors, what empire could stand against them? The massacre at Otrar that we began with was just the spark that ignited an even greater conflagration. The Khwarezmian Empire, stretching across modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, was about to face the full fury of Mongol wrath. Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad II had made the fatal mistake of underestimating these steppe warriors. He would pay for this error with his empire and his life. In 1219, Genghis Khan personally led an army of 150,000 warriors across the steppes toward Khwarezmia. What followed was one of the most devastating military campaigns in human history. The Mongols moved with their characteristic lightning speed, striking multiple targets simultaneously and preventing their enemies from coordinating an effective defense. City after city fell with terrifying efficiency. The siege of Samarkand in 1220 demonstrated the evolved sophistication of Mongol siegecraft. This ancient city, protected by massive walls and defended by a garrison of 60,000 warriors, had never fallen to foreign invaders. Yet the Mongols breached its defenses in just 5 days. They used captured civilians as human shields, forcing them to fill the city's moat with earth and stones. This ruthless tactic not only protected Mongol warriors, but also inflicted psychological trauma on the defenders who were forced to watch their own people die. The fall of Samarkand was followed by an even more shocking event: the complete destruction of Merv, one of the largest cities in the world at that time. Contemporary sources claim that over 1 million people were slaughtered when the city refused to surrender. While this number may be exaggerated, the scale of destruction was undeniably massive. The Mongols systematically demolished the city's irrigation systems, ensuring that it would never recover its former prosperity. The speed and totality of these conquests left the Islamic world reeling. Within 2 years, the Khwarezmian Empire had been completely destroyed. Shah Muhammad died as a refugee on an island in the Caspian Sea, his empire nothing but a memory. The Mongols had demonstrated that no civilization, no matter how ancient or sophisticated, was safe from their advance. But Genghis Khan's ambitions extended even further west. In 1221, he dispatched 2 of his greatest generals, Jabi and Subutai, on an extraordinary reconnaissance mission that would take them around the Caspian Sea and into the heart of Europe. This expedition, originally intended to pursue the fleeing Khwarezmid Shah, became one of the most remarkable military adventures in history. With just 20,000 warriors, these 2 generals defeated multiple armies and conquered vast territories as they swept through the Caucasus and into the Russian steppes. At the Battle of Kalka River in 1223, they annihilated a combined Russian and Cuman army despite being heavily outnumbered. The speed and coordination of their attack left their enemies bewildered and broken. This victory sent shockwaves throughout Europe. For the first time, Western Christians realized that a new and terrible enemy had appeared on their eastern frontier. Accounts of the battle describe Mongol warriors moving like ghosts across the battlefield, appearing and disappearing with supernatural speed, raining arrows down on their enemies before vanishing again into the dust and smoke. The death of Genghis Khan in 1227 did not slow the Mongol advance. If anything, it accelerated it. His successor, Ogedei Khan, possessed the same strategic vision as his father, but with even greater resources at his disposal. The Mongol Empire was now a well-oiled machine of conquest with experienced generals, proven tactics, and an unstoppable momentum. The second invasion of Europe, launched in 1237, was far more systematic and devastating than the first. Led by Batu Khan and the brilliant general Subutai, Mongol armies swept through Russia like wildfire. Moscow, Kiev, and dozens of other cities fell in rapid succession. The fragmented Russian principalities, weakened by constant warfare among themselves, could offer no coordinated resistance to this overwhelming force. The siege of Kiev in 1240 marked the end of the Kievan Rus as a major power. This ancient city, known as the mother of Russian cities, fell after a brutal siege that left it in ruins. Contemporary accounts describe the city as so completely destroyed that only 200 houses remained standing amid the rubble. The psychological impact on Eastern Europe was devastating. The great centers of Orthodox Christianity lay in ashes, and it seemed as though the apocalypse itself had been unleashed upon the world. The Mongol war machine then turned its attention to Poland and Hungary. The Battle of Mohi in 1241 demonstrated the tactical superiority of Mongol forces over traditional European heavy cavalry. King Bela IV of Hungary watched helplessly as his army of 60,000 warriors was systematically destroyed by a smaller Mongol force. The Mongols used their superior mobility to outflank and surround the Hungarian knights, turning their heavy armor from an advantage into a death trap. The psychological warfare employed by the Mongols reached new heights during these European campaigns. They would often spare one out of every 10 captives, sending them ahead to spread terror about the approaching army. These traumatized survivors would describe scenes of unimaginable brutality, creating panic among civilian populations and weakening the resolve of defending armies. By 1241, Mongol forces had advanced to within striking distance of Vienna and the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade, not against the Muslims in the Holy Land, but against these pagan invaders from the east. All of Christian Europe held its breath, waiting to see if their civilization could survive this unprecedented assault. Then, suddenly, the invasion stopped. News arrived that Ogedei Khan had died in Mongolia, and all Mongol generals were recalled to participate in selecting a new great Khan. This reprieve saved Western Europe from conquest, but it was a near thing. Had Ogedei lived another few years, the history of Europe and indeed the entire world might have been completely different. The Mongols, however, would soon suffer their first major setback. In 1260, the Battle of Ain Jalut in the Levant marked a turning point. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, had sacked Baghdad in 1258, destroying the Abbasid Caliphate. But when the Mongol forces clashed with the Mamluks of Egypt at Ain Jalut, they faced a disciplined cavalry force that mirrored their own tactics. Using superior knowledge of the terrain and a clever feigned retreat, the Mamluks crushed the Mongol army. For the first time, the myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered, and their westward expansion was halted. The Mongol approach to siege warfare evolved dramatically throughout their conquests. Initially dependent on Chinese engineers and techniques, they eventually developed their own innovations that made them nearly unstoppable against fortified positions. They pioneered the use of psychological warfare during sieges, employing captured civilians as human shields and using torture and terror to break the will of defenders. Their intelligence networks were equally sophisticated. Mongol armies rarely moved blindly into enemy territory. They maintained extensive spy networks that provided detailed information about enemy strengths, weaknesses, and internal conflicts. This intelligence advantage allowed them to exploit divisions among their enemies and strike at precisely the right moment for maximum effect. The Mongols also demonstrated remarkable adaptability to different environments and enemies. Against the Chinese, they learned siege warfare and bureaucratic administration. Against the Muslims, they adopted elements of Islamic military science and administration. Against the Europeans, they refined their cavalry tactics to deal with heavy armor and different battlefield conditions. This flexibility was one of their greatest strengths. The conquest of Baghdad in 1258 by Hulagu Khan marked one of the most traumatic events in Islamic history. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had ruled the Islamic world for over 500 years, was completely destroyed. The last caliph, al-Mustasim, was executed along with most of his family. The great libraries of Baghdad, repositories of centuries of Islamic learning, were thrown into the Tigris River. It was said that the river ran black with ink and red with blood. This destruction of Baghdad represented more than just military conquest. It was the end of the Islamic Golden Age and the destruction of one of the world's great centers of learning and culture. The psychological impact on the Islamic world was devastating and long-lasting. For many Muslims, it seemed as though God himself had abandoned them to these pagan destroyers. The Mongols' ambitions were not confined to the land. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis and one of history's greatest rulers, would take the empire to new heights. By 1271, he had established the Yuan dynasty in China, becoming the first non-Han emperor to rule all of China. Kublai moved the capital to what is now Beijing and built a sophisticated administration that blended Mongol traditions with Chinese bureaucracy. Under his rule, China became a hub of global trade and culture. However, Kublai's attempts to expand the empire further met resistance, particularly at sea. His two massive invasions of Japan in 1274 and 1281 were famously thwarted by typhoons, dubbed kamikaze, or divine winds, by the Japanese. These failed invasions showed that even the mighty Mongols had limits, especially in naval warfare. During Kublai's reign, the Mongols also extended their influence into Southeast Asia, launching campaigns into Vietnam, Burma, and Java. Though they achieved some successes, the jungles and tropical climates proved difficult for their steppe cavalry, highlighting the geographic boundaries of their military power. The Mongol impact on global trade was equally revolutionary. The establishment of the Pax Mongolica created unprecedented opportunities for long-distance commerce. Under Mongol protection, merchants could travel safely from Europe to China for the first time in history. The Silk Road experienced a golden age as Mongol rulers actively promoted trade and cultural exchange. This expansion of trade networks had profound consequences for global development. Technologies, ideas, and diseases spread across Eurasia with unprecedented speed. Gunpowder technology, originally developed in China, reached Europe via the Mongol trade routes. The compass, printing techniques, and mathematical concepts all spread along these same pathways. However, this interconnectedness also had darker consequences. The same trade routes that carried silk and spices also carried the bubonic plague. The Black Death that devastated Europe in the 14th century likely spread along Mongol trade networks, demonstrating the double-edged nature of globalization. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, was perhaps their greatest administrative innovation. This network of relay stations allowed messages and small packages to travel across the entire empire with remarkable speed. A message could travel from Beijing to Eastern Europe in just a few months, faster than any communication system that existed before the modern era. The Mongols also established unique diplomatic ties with Europe. As the threat of Mongol expansion loomed, several European leaders, including King Louis IX of France and Pope Innocent IV, sent envoys to the Mongol court. Some saw the Mongols as potential allies against Muslim powers during the Crusades. While no lasting alliance emerged, these exchanges opened channels for knowledge, trade, and cultural contact between East and West that would later influence the European Renaissance. The cultural impact of Mongol rule was equally significant. The Mongols were remarkably tolerant of different religions and cultures, often adopting local customs and beliefs. This religious tolerance was partly pragmatic as it reduced resistance to Mongol rule, but it also reflected a genuine respect for learning and achievement regardless of its source. Mongol rulers often patronized scholars, artists, and craftsmen from conquered territories. The Yuan dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, became a period of remarkable cultural flowering. The Ming dynasty that followed owed much of its administrative structure and cultural achievements to foundations laid during Mongol rule. The military innovations pioneered by the Mongols influenced warfare for centuries. Their emphasis on mobility, coordination, and psychological warfare became standard elements of military doctrine. Even today, Modern military strategists study Mongol campaigns for insights into rapid deployment and combined arms tactics. The decimal organization system used by Mongol armies was adopted by many later military forces. The emphasis on merit over birth in selecting officers also influenced military reforms in various countries. The Mongol approach to logistics and supply, particularly their ability to maintain armies over vast distances, provided models for later military campaigns. The fragmentation of the Mongol Empire after 1260 did not diminish its historical significance. The successor states, including the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, continued to shape regional development for centuries. The Yuan dynasty's influence on Chinese culture and administration was profound and lasting. Many institutions established during Mongol rule continued under subsequent Chinese dynasties. The Grand Canal system, which connected northern and southern China, was extensively developed during the Yuan period and remained crucial to Chinese unity and prosperity. In Persia, the Ilkhanate's patronage of art and learning led to a remarkable cultural renaissance. Persian miniature painting reached new heights of sophistication under Mongol patronage. The integration of Chinese artistic techniques with Persian traditions created entirely new forms of artistic expression. The Golden Horde's rule over Russia had equally lasting consequences. The tribute system established by the Mongols influenced Russian administrative practices for centuries. Many Russian nobles traced their authority back to Mongol grants, and the centralized nature of the later Russian government owed much to Mongol administrative models. The Mongol Empire's influence on global demographics was staggering. Some historians estimate that the Mongol conquests resulted in the death of up to 10% of the world's population. Entire regions were depopulated, while others experienced massive population movements as people fled advancing armies or were forcibly relocated. These demographic changes had long-term economic and cultural consequences. The destruction of irrigation systems in Central Asia and Persia led to the permanent decline of some regions that had been prosperous for millennia. Conversely, other areas benefited from the influx of refugees and skilled craftsmen displaced by Mongol conquests. The environmental impact of Mongol conquests was equally significant. The destruction of agricultural systems and the abandonment of cultivated land led to reforestation in some areas. Some scientists argue that this reforestation contributed to global cooling during the Little Ice Age, demonstrating how human conflict can have planetary consequences. The Mongol approach to governance was remarkably sophisticated for a nomadic people. They developed administrative systems that could effectively rule sedentary populations while maintaining their own cultural identity. The concept of universal law, applied equally to all subjects regardless of ethnic or religious background, was revolutionary for its time. The Mongol legal code, known as the Yasa, established principles that influenced legal development across their empire. The emphasis on religious tolerance, protection of merchants, and merit-based advancement created a framework for effective governance that outlasted Mongol political control in many regions. The decline of the Mongol Empire was as dramatic as its rise. By 1350, the unified empire had completely fragmented into competing successor states. The same factors that had made Mongol expansion possible, particularly their mobility and adaptability, made permanent unity difficult to maintain over such vast distances and diverse populations. Climate change may have played a role in Mongol decline. The warming period that had made expansion across the steppes easier gave way to cooler temperatures that reduced the productivity of grasslands essential for Mongol horses. This environmental pressure, combined with political fragmentation, reduced the military effectiveness of Mongol forces. The rise of gunpowder weapons also reduced the advantages of traditional Mongol cavalry tactics. As firearms became more common and effective, the mobility and archery skills that had made Mongol warriors nearly invincible became less decisive. New military technologies favored infantry formations and siege artillery rather than mounted archers. The Black Death that swept across Eurasia in the 14th century devastated Mongol territories as much as their former enemies. The same trade networks that had brought prosperity to the Mongol Empire also carried plague, reducing populations and disrupting the economic foundations of Mongol power. Despite their eventual decline, the Mongol impact on world history cannot be overstated. They created the first truly global empire, connecting East and West in ways that had never been possible before. The exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures that occurred under Mongol rule laid the foundation for the modern world. The Mongol Empire demonstrated that small, well-organized forces could defeat much larger enemies through superior strategy, mobility, and coordination. This lesson influenced military thinking for centuries and continues to be relevant in modern warfare. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongols showed that barriers between civilizations were not insurmountable. Their empire brought together Chinese, Islamic, Christian, and nomadic cultures in unprecedented ways. While this integration was often violent and traumatic, it also created new forms of art, science, and philosophy that enriched human civilization. Today, as we face our own challenges of globalization and cultural integration, the Mongol experience offers both warnings and inspiration. It shows us the potential for both creation and destruction that exists when different peoples and cultures come into contact. The choice between conflict and cooperation, between terror and tolerance, remains as relevant today as it was 8 centuries ago. The thundering hooves that once shook the earth from China to Hungary have long since fallen silent. The great Khans who commanded the loyalty of millions are now just names in history books. But the world they created, the connections they forged, and the lessons they taught about power, adaptation, and human potential continue to resonate through the centuries. In an age when we can travel around the world in hours rather than years, when ideas spread at the speed of light rather than the pace of horses, we are all living in the world that the Mongols made possible. The empire of the steppes may have crumbled, but its legacy gallops on through history, reminding us that the impossible is merely the untried, and that sometimes the greatest changes come from the most unexpected places. If this journey through the origins of warfare intrigued you, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and follow us for more deep dives into the moments that shaped human history. Until next time, stay curious, stay bold, and keep exploring the past to understand the present.